What would you do if the person you trusted most discarded you at the very moment you needed them? Evelyn Carter was once just a secretary in a towering Chicago office, a woman invisible in the eyes of her powerful boss, Richard Hale. But one night changed everything, a night of passion, a secret that grew into 3 fragile lives. And when Evelyn found the courage to share her truth, she was met not with love, but with a cold check and the sting of betrayal. Escorted out of the building, pregnant and alone, Evelyn could have disappeared. Instead, she chose fire. She built a new life from scratch, raising 3 boys while carving her way into the brutal world of tech. And 5 years later, when fate brought her back to Chicago, she didn't return as a forgotten secretary. She returned as the CEO of a billion-dollar empire, ready to face the man who had once destroyed her. But here's the question. Is this a story of revenge or something deeper? Stay with us, because you won't believe how this battle ends. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss a single chapter of Evelyn's extraordinary journey. Evelyn Carter never thought her life would unravel so quickly. At 30 years old, she was careful, steady, and proud of her work as an executive secretary at Hale Industries, one of Denver's most powerful technology firms. She arrived early every morning, coffee in hand, her heels clicking across the marble floor of the downtown high-rise. Her desk was always immaculate, every pen aligned, every file tabbed, every schedule confirmed down to the minute. And yet, none of that seemed to matter the night she made the mistake of believing her boss saw her as more than an assistant. Richard Hale, the CEO, was the kind of man who filled a room just by walking into it. Tall, with broad shoulders and a self-assured smile, he was born into wealth. His father had founded Hale Industries decades earlier, and Richard inherited not only the business, but also the confidence of someone who had never truly tasted failure. To Evelyn, he was both intimidating and magnetic. She had worked beside him for 4 years, scheduling his meetings, arranging his travel, reading the tone of his moods before he spoke. She thought she knew him. One late evening, after a long day preparing for a shareholder meeting, Richard lingered in the office instead of leaving as usual. The building was quiet, city lights glowing beyond the glass walls. Evelyn stayed late too, typing revisions into his speech. When he poured 2 glasses of wine and set one on her desk, she hesitated. "You've been carrying me all week," he said with that disarming grin. "At least, let me say thank you." Her pulse quickened. She knew the dangers of blurred boundaries, yet part of her longed for recognition, for someone to notice she was more than efficient typing hands. They talked longer than they ever had before. He asked about her childhood in Colorado Springs, about her favorite books, about why she never went back to graduate school. His attention felt intoxicating. That night, one impulsive decision led her into his arms. It wasn't romantic, not really, but in the quiet afterward, she let herself believe maybe this meant something. Maybe the invisible line between employer and employee had shifted into something human. The hope lasted less than 12 hours. The next morning, Richard avoided her gaze. By noon, she was summoned to human resources. A folder sat on the desk, termination papers, already typed. The explanation was curt. Position no longer necessary. She stared at the forms, her ears ringing. "But I've been with the company for years. I know the entire executive schedule inside and out. Why the HR director wouldn't meet her eyes? This comes directly from Mr. Hale." It was Richard himself who passed her in the hallway as she walked out carrying a cardboard box of belongings. He didn't slow down, didn't speak. His gaze slid right over her as if she had become invisible overnight. Shame scorched her cheeks. Co-workers turned away, whispering, in less than a day. Evelyn Carter had gone from valued employee to disposable mistake. She packed the rest of her life into her old sedan and drove home to her modest apartment on the edge of the city. The silence inside pressed down like a weight. She replayed the night over and over, asking herself where she had been foolish, why she had trusted him, why she thought she mattered. Weeks later, the nausea began, the exhaustion, the late-night runs to the bathroom. The doctor's test confirmed what her trembling hands already suspected. She was pregnant, sitting alone in her car outside the clinic, the papers folded on the passenger seat. She wept until her throat ached. Richard Hale's child or children would be hers to raise alone. She considered calling him, imagined his dismissive tone, the impatient glance at his watch. She couldn't bear to give him another chance to discard her. Still, doubt gnawed at her. Could she survive this? She had no savings beyond a few $1,000s. Her parents were gone. Friends urged her to make the sensible choice, to terminate and move on. But Evelyn couldn't. She touched her stomach, still flat beneath her blouse, and whispered, "I don't know how yet, but I'll fight for you." At night she lay awake, torn between fear and fierce determination. Her mind circled questions with no answers. How do you raise a child without support? What if I fail? What if I'm not enough? And beneath it all, a sharper wound. Why wasn't I worth even a second thought to him? The shame burned, but so did something else, a spark, faint but steady. Evelyn Carter had been discarded, yes, but she would not stay discarded. Evelyn Carter never planned on being a mother, at least not like this alone, without support, without even the courtesy of acknowledgement from the man who had helped create this life. Yet, when the clinic asked if she wanted to terminate, she couldn't bring herself to sign. The thought of erasing the tiny heartbeat inside her felt unbearable. So, she made her choice. She would carry the pregnancy, no matter the cost. Her one-bedroom apartment on the edge of Denver was already cramped, with peeling linoleum floors and a stubborn radiator that clanked in protest each winter night. The kitchen smelled faintly of the previous tenant's cooking oil, and the carpet was thin enough that her downstairs neighbor complained every time she moved a chair. But it was all she could afford after losing her job, and soon she would have to make it stretch further. Evelyn pieced together income however she could. She typed legal transcripts at night, cleaned offices on weekends, and sold handmade crafts on online marketplaces. Her hands ached, her eyes burned from exhaustion, and yet she pushed forward because she had no choice. The pregnancy was harder than she imagined. She spent long hours in sterile clinic waiting rooms, the scent of antiseptic thick in the air, surrounded by couples holding hands while she sat alone. Each time the nurse called her name, she rose with shoulders squared, determined not to show the ache in her chest. When the doctor finally confirmed she was carrying not one, but 3 babies, she almost fainted. "Triplets," he said gently, as if cushioning the blow. "Triplets, 3 lives, 3 mouths to feed, 3 futures depending on her." Her knees shook as she walked out of the clinic, the ultrasound pictures clutched in her trembling hands. In the parking lot, she sat behind the steering wheel of her old sedan, staring at the blurry images. All at once, she laughed and cried. The sounds tangled together until they became a raw sob. "How am I supposed to do this?" she whispered. The months that followed blurred into a haze of medical appointments, swollen ankles, and restless nights. She grew heavier, slower, yet somehow sharper, her will forged in fear and love. Friends drifted away, not unkindly, but uncertain of how to stand beside someone fighting a battle they couldn't imagine. Evelyn stopped expecting them to understand. The day of the birth came too soon. Just 29 weeks into her pregnancy, contractions started. Panic seized her as she was rushed into the hospital, the fluorescent lights glaring down, the beeping of monitors filling the air. The delivery was a blur of masked doctors, urgent voices, and the sterile smell of latex gloves. Then 3 cries, thin but fierce. Matthew, Michael, Mason, her sons. Each weighed less than 3 pounds, their tiny bodies covered in wires and tubes inside the neonatal intensive care unit. Evelyn pressed her hands against the plastic incubators, whispering promises through tears. "I will fight for you. I will not let you down." The bills arrived before she even left the hospital. Stacks of paper with numbers so large they seemed unreal. She carried the envelopes home in her purse, unopened for days, afraid to confirm the reality she already knew she was drowning before she had even begun. Still, she pressed forward. Nights became her battleground. She fed one baby while the other two cried, their wails echoing off the apartment's thin walls. Her body screamed for rest, but there was no rest to be found when, by some miracle, all three slept. She opened her laptop at the kitchen table. She transcribed interviews, corrected grammar for college essays, even wrote product reviews for a few extra dollars. Her fingers tapped keys in the dim glow of the screen, while the hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Some nights, she thought about Richard. She pictured him in his penthouse, perhaps sipping aged whiskey, or laughing at some elegant dinner, utterly unaware of the lives he had left behind. Anger coursed through her veins at the memory of his dismissal, the way he had walked past her with empty eyes, as if she were nothing. And yet, buried under that anger, there remained a foolish spark of hope. A part of her still imagined the phone might ring, that his voice might stumble through an apology, that he might ask how she was, how their children were. That call never came. Instead, Evelyn poured her love into the three tiny boys who depended on her. Matthew clutched her finger with surprising strength. Michael calmed only when swaddled in the perfect folds. And Mason stared at her with wide, solemn eyes that seemed far older than his weeks of life. They were fragile, yet determined, just like her. As dawn painted the Denver sky in soft pinks and golds, Evelyn rocked Mason against her chest, the baby's warm breath tickling her collarbone. Exhaustion pressed on her like a physical weight, but she refused to close her eyes. She whispered to him, and to herself, "We'll make it. Somehow. We'll make it." The first year with the triplets nearly broke Evelyn Carter. Her days blurred into endless feedings, diaper changes, and the quiet terror of watching three fragile lives grow stronger, inch by inch. Yet somewhere amid the sleepless nights and unpaid bills, she discovered something unexpected, the faint stirrings of a dream. It started with numbers. She had always loved patterns, even as a girl in Colorado Springs, solving puzzles while her classmates groaned over math homework. At Hale Industries, she had been the one to notice scheduling inefficiencies before anyone else, the one who could glance at a chart and see the story hidden between the lines. Richard used to rely on her instincts for reorganizing travel itineraries and corporate logistics, though he never gave her credit. Now, with three infants asleep in bassinets lined up beside her couch, Evelyn found herself opening her old laptop. The keys stuck, the battery ran hot, but it still worked. She dusted off her knowledge of Excel, then graduated to programming tutorials online, Python, SQL, a little JavaScript words that once belonged to another life now returned like old friends. Each night after midnight, once bottles were washed and the apartment finally quiet, she sank into study. The glow of the screen painted her face as she practiced code, her mind hungry in ways her body was too tired to admit. Sometimes she cradled Mason in one arm while typing with the other, whispering queries aloud like lullabies. Select. From hope, where resilience. Es basbar des true. One evening, as snow pressed against the window panes, an idea struck her. Local delivery companies, the ones she used when selling crafts or receiving baby supplies, were constantly late, constantly wasting fuel. Their routes overlapped, their drivers sat idle. She scribbled notes in a spiral-bound notebook: optimization, predictive scheduling, dynamic rerouting. Could she build something that solved that problem? Aurora Analytics. The name came to her while watching the dawn paint the sky in streaks of orange and violet. It symbolized light after darkness, a rising glow just like her life, just like her boys. She poured weeks into building a rudimentary prototype. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. The program could take delivery addresses and suggest efficient routes, saving time and fuel. With trembling hands, she reached out to small businesses, florists, bakeries, local grocers. Most ignored her. A few agreed to listen. The first pitch was in the back room of a neighborhood grocery store, Her laptop balanced on a stack of boxes. Evelyn explained how the software could cut their delivery costs by nearly 20%. The owner, a balding man in his 50s, shook his head. "You're just some single mom with a computer. I can't risk my business on that." The words stung. The second pitch ended the same way, and the third, and the fourth. She stood in diners, storage rooms, and cluttered offices, watching skeptical eyes dismiss her before she finished speaking. Sometimes they smirked, sometimes they laughed outright. One particularly harsh encounter lingered in her memory. A logistics manager leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Lady, you can barely keep your kids quiet in the lobby, and you want me to believe you can run data for a company. You should focus on being a mother. Leave business to people who know what they're doing." Evelyn clenched her fists under the table, nails digging into her palms. She smiled tightly, thanked him for his time, and walked out. But in the parking lot, with the cold wind biting her cheeks, she let the tears fall. "They look at me and see just a single mother," she whispered to the night sky. "But I know I'm more." The failures piled up, but so did her determination. Each rejection fueled her resolve. She revised her program, studied market trends, learned to refine her presentations. She scoured used bookstores for business guides, borrowed library books about startups, watched free lectures online while the triplets toddled at her feet. Life remained brutally hard. The boys grew Matthew asking endless questions, Michael carefully stacking blocks into neat towers, Mason sitting quietly with a gaze that seemed to see right through her. They were her joy and her anchor, but they also meant constant exhaustion. She balanced bottles and balance sheets, playtime and programming. One night, after yet another rejection, she almost closed her laptop for good. She stared at the blinking cursor, the silence of the apartment broken only by Matthew's soft snoring. Her mind screamed, "Maybe they're right. Maybe you can't do this." But then she looked at the 3 sleeping faces in the bassinets lined up like soldiers beside her bed. She saw the rise and fall of their tiny chests, the curl of Mason's fist, the furrow of Michael's brow even in dreams, and something hardened inside her. She opened a new line of code and typed, her hands steady. Because Evelyn Carter was not just a single mother. She was a woman building a future no one else could imagine. The winter Evelyn Carter nearly gave up was the winter Thomas Reed appeared. She was standing at the edge of another rejection, this time in a small co-working cafe downtown. Her pitch deck was printed on cheap paper, the color ink fading. Across the table, a young manager from a delivery company closed the folder without even finishing. "It's interesting," he said, his tone patronizing. "But we already have vendors. Maybe in a few years." Evelyn thanked him politely, though her throat felt tight. She gathered her papers, stuffed them into her worn leather bag, and forced a smile. When she stepped into the cold evening air, her breath fogged against the streetlights. She stood still for a moment, wondering if all this struggle was foolish. Maybe she was just a single mother with a laptop after all. A voice broke her thoughts. "Excuse me, Miss Carter." She turned. An older man in a wool coat and flat cap approached, his gray beard trimmed neatly. His eyes were kind but sharp, the sort of eyes that had seen much of the world and missed nothing. "I couldn't help overhearing," he said, gesturing back toward the cafe window. "You were talking about logistics software." Evelyn stiffened. She was used to being dismissed, sometimes even mocked. "Yes," she said cautiously. "It's a system I've been developing." The man extended his hand. "Thomas Reed. Retired from the freight industry, though I keep my ear to the ground. Mind if I buy you a coffee?" Something in his manner disarmed her, the respect in his voice, the absence of condescension. She hesitated, then nodded, inside, over steaming mugs. She explained Aurora Analytics. She pulled out her laptop, showed him the prototype, the route simulations, the potential cost savings. Unlike so many before him, Thomas didn't interrupt. He leaned closer, asked thoughtful questions, scribbled notes on a napkin. When she finished, he sat back with a slow smile. "Miss Carter, do you know what you have here? Another idea no one will fund," she said bitterly. He chuckled. "No. You have the beginnings of something real, something the industry has needed for years. Most people can't see it because they don't know the problem like I do. But I spent 40 years watching companies bleed money because of inefficiency. Your system, if refined, could change the game." Her throat tightened. She blinked back sudden tears. "But no one takes me seriously. I'm just—" "Don't you dare finish that sentence." Thomas interrupted gently. "You're not just anything. You're a founder. You're a visionary. The fact that you're also raising 3 children only proves your strength." His words sank into her like warmth after a long freeze. Over the following weeks, Thomas became more than a chance encounter. He visited her apartment, stepping carefully over toys and baby blankets. He sat at her cluttered kitchen table while she showed him updates to the software, while the boys played in the background. He invested a modest sum, just enough to buy a better computer, register Aurora Analytics as a proper company, and rent a tiny office space above a laundromat. But, more than money, he gave her mentorship. He taught her how to speak the language of investors, how to frame her pitch not just as code, but as a solution. He introduced her to people he trusted, doors that had always been locked suddenly opening. Life was still far from easy. Evelyn still worked late nights, still fought fatigue, still balanced business plans with bedtime stories. But for the first time, she didn't feel entirely alone. The triplets grew alongside her dream. At 4 years old, their personalities were already distinct. Matthew, ever curious, asked 1,000 questions a day. "Mama, how does the toaster know when to pop? Why is the sky blue? What does algorithm mean?" His wide eyes made her laugh, even when exhaustion pressed on her. Michael, precise and orderly, lined up his toy cars in perfect rows, sorted his crayons by color, and scolded his brothers when they knocked things over. "Rules keep us safe," he declared solemnly one morning, echoing something he must have overheard from Thomas. Mason, quiet and contemplative, often sat by the window staring out at the world, as though he carried thoughts too big for his small frame. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words surprised her with their depth. "Mama, why do people forget to be kind?" he asked one night, tilting his head like an old philosopher. Their laughter filled the apartment, their arguments echoed down the hall, and their little feet left trails of mud across the floor. They were chaos and light, and Evelyn loved them fiercely. Some evenings, when they were finally asleep, she sat at her desk in the corner of the apartment. The glow of her new computer screen reflected in the framed ultrasound photo she kept nearby. She opened spreadsheets, tinkered with algorithms, refined the Aurora Analytics platform. And when discouragement whispered, she remembered Thomas's words, "You're not just anything." Hope was fragile, but it was enough to keep her going. One night, after sending off yet another proposal, she closed the laptop and stood at the window. The city lights glittered in the distance, each one a reminder that she wasn't finished yet. For the first time in years, Evelyn allowed herself to imagine not just survival, but success. Aurora Analytics was still tiny, still precarious, but it was alive, and so was she. Aurora Analytics was not an overnight success. There were no sudden windfalls, no viral headlines. Instead, it grew like Evelyn herself, slowly, stubbornly, one small victory at a time. The first contract came from a corner grocery store on the north side of Denver. Evelyn had pitched them months earlier and been politely dismissed. But when fuel costs spiked, the owner called her back. She installed her software on their outdated desktop computer, trained the manager's nephew to use it, and waited. 2 weeks later, he phoned her, voice brimming with disbelief. "We cut delivery time by nearly 20%. Do you realize how much gas that saves?" Evelyn exhaled a shaky laugh. "Yes," she whispered. "I do." The grocery store led to a florist, the florist to a bakery, the bakery to a small chain of organic markets. Word spread slowly, but it spread. Each new client brought a little revenue, enough to cover another month of rent for her tiny office above the laundromat, enough to upgrade her laptop once more. But progress came tangled with chaos. One Tuesday afternoon, Evelyn sat on a Zoom call with the procurement manager of a regional supermarket chain. She wore a blazer over a wrinkled t-shirt, her hair hastily tied back. Behind the camera's frame, Matthew and Michael argued over a toy truck, their voices rising. Mason sat quietly at the table, drawing spirals in a notebook. "Mrs. Carter," the manager said, "we'd like to see a cost-benefit analysis over a 6-month period." A shriek cut through the room. Matthew had snatched the truck, Michael was wailing, and Mason sighed deeply as if weary of their endless battles. Evelyn muted herself mid-sentence, pressed the headset against her chest, and whispered fiercely, "Boys, please, not now." She shoved the toy into Mason's hand's neutral territory and unmuted with a strained smile. "Of course. I can have that report on your desk by tomorrow morning." When the call ended, she collapsed against her chair, torn between laughter and tears. This was her life, pitching algorithms while refereeing toy wars. Other days were harder still. One winter night, Michael woke feverish, his small body burning as she pressed a damp cloth to his forehead. Matthew whined that he couldn't sleep. Mason clung silently to her arm. Meanwhile, her phone buzzed with an urgent email from a client whose system had crashed. She sat on the edge of the bed, laptop balanced on her knees, while Michael whimpered in her lap. Code blurred on the screen as exhaustion clouded her eyes. But she pushed through, typing with one hand, soothing her son with the other. At dawn, the bug was fixed. Michael's fever had broken, and Evelyn sat slumped against the wall, whispering a prayer of gratitude. Every obstacle seemed designed to test her resolve. A server crashed the night before a demo. A prospective investor laughed at her financial projections. Once, she spilled coffee across her only printed proposal 30 minutes before a meeting and had to sprint to the nearest print shop with the triplets in tow. Yet each trial carved her sharper, steadier. Thomas Reed reminded her often, "Steel is forged in fire. Evelyn, every hardship makes you stronger." She wanted to believe him. Sometimes she did. Other times, she only felt tired. Still, the triplets gave her fuel. Matthew's endless questions forced her to explain concepts simply, which sharpened her own understanding. "Mama, why do trucks need roots? Can't they just drive where they want?" She laughed, then launched into a 5-year-old's version of supply chain management. Michael kept her organized. He lined up her sticky notes by color, stacked her binders, and scolded her when she misplaced a pen. "Mama, you have to follow the rules," he'd insist, brows furrowed in miniature seriousness. And Mason, quiet. Mason would crawl onto her lap during long nights at the computer. He never asked for much. He simply rested his head against her, his steady breathing reminding her she wasn't truly alone. Aurora Analytics grew brick by brick, built not just on Evelyn's vision, but on these moments of persistence. She wasn't building a company in spite of her children, she was building it with them, around them, because of them. By the end of the second year, Aurora had secured contracts with 3 regional supermarket chains. The numbers were modest by industry standards, but monumental for her. The office above the laundromat now buzzed with the hum of 2 part-time employees, both young mothers themselves who needed flexible hours. Evelyn insisted they bring their children if necessary. Toys and coloring books filled a corner of the office. Some evenings, after everyone left, she stood by the dusty window overlooking the street. The neon glow from the laundromat sign flickered below. Evelyn would watch the lights of passing cars, her reflection faint in the glass, and feel a quiet pride. She wasn't rich, she wasn't powerful, not yet, but Aurora Analytics was alive, feeding her children and proving to the world and to herself that she was more than just a single mother. The road was long, and she knew there would be more failures, more sleepless nights, but she had survived humiliation, poverty, and despair. She could survive this too, brick by brick. She was building not only a business, but a future. 3 years passed like a storm, loud, chaotic, exhausting, but also full of unexpected growth. What began as Evelyn Carter's late-night project at a cluttered kitchen table had transformed into a company people were beginning to notice. Aurora Analytics was no longer just a name scribbled in her spiral notebook. It was a small but respected tech firm serving grocery chains, regional retailers, and even a medical supply distributor. Evelyn had hired a handful of employees, most of them women, many of them mothers who, like her, needed a workplace that understood flexibility. The office above the laundromat had been replaced with a modest suite in a downtown building. The furniture was secondhand, the Wi-Fi unreliable, but to Evelyn, it felt like stepping into the future every time she turned the key in the office door. The press took notice. 2. A local journalist wrote an article about Aurora, calling Evelyn the Phoenix of Denver, a woman who had risen from personal ashes to build something remarkable. The nickname stuck. Soon other papers picked it up, and Evelyn found her face on the cover of small business magazines. The interviews felt surreal. She still struggled to pay bills some months, still juggled sick days and software bugs. And yet, the world was starting to see her as a rising star. With recognition came opportunity. A venture capital firm, based in Boulder, approached her with an offer $5 million in exchange for a minority stake in Aurora Analytics. Evelyn sat across the conference table from a row of sharp-suited investors, her palms sweating as they listed terms. She expected the old dismissals, the smirks, the patronizing tone she'd heard so often. Instead, they leaned forward, nodding. They saw her vision, not her circumstances. She signed the deal with trembling hands. For the first time, Aurora had the capital to grow. The impact was immediate. Evelyn expanded her team, leased better servers, polished the software interface, and secured contracts with a regional supermarket giant. Revenue multiplied, and the once fragile dream solidified into a thriving company. But amid the flurry of board meetings and client demos, Evelyn never forgot why she was fighting. Her 3 sons were now 7 years old, full of energy and mischief, their personalities sharper with each passing season. Matthew's questions grew more complex. Mama, how do airplanes stay in the sky if they're so heavy? Why do some stars shine brighter than others? Evelyn did her best to answer, and when she didn't know, she looked it up with him. Teaching him curiosity was a strength. Michael remained the family's organizer. He lined up his cereal boxes, made color-coded chore charts for his brothers, and insisted on timing their homework sessions with a kitchen timer. His seriousness sometimes made Evelyn laugh, but she admired his discipline. And Mason's sweet, quiet. Mason often sat in the backyard with a sketchbook, drawing trees, animals, even complicated diagrams of imaginary machines. His teachers whispered that he might be gifted, though Evelyn already knew. There was something profound in his silence, a depth that often startled her. For years, the boys had lived in cramped apartments where space was always tight and noise always traveled. But after the Boulder investment, Evelyn allowed herself a dream she had buried long ago, a home with a yard. She found it on a quiet street in a Denver suburb, a small house with peeling paint and an overgrown lawn, but a sturdy frame and a fenced backyard. The moment she stepped onto the grass, she knew. This wasn't just a house. This was the beginning of a childhood her sons deserved. The day they moved in, the boys ran across the patchy yard, their laughter ringing against the wooden fence. Evelyn stood on the porch, boxes stacked around her, and pressed a hand to her chest. Tears blurred her vision as she watched them race in circles, their sneakers kicking up clumps of dirt. "Is it really ours?" Matthew shouted, his voice full of disbelief. "Yes," Evelyn called back, her voice breaking with emotion. "It's ours." Michael immediately began planning. "We can build a garden here," he said, pointing at the corner, "and maybe a swing set here. But we have to keep it clean. Mama, we need rules." Mason simply dropped to the grass, lying flat on his back, staring at the sky as if claiming it for himself. After a long pause, he whispered, "It feels like freedom." Evelyn knelt beside him, brushing her hand over his hair. Freedom. That was exactly what it was. That evening, as the sun set over their new home, Evelyn set 3 paper plates of pizza on the back porch. The boys sat cross-legged on the steps, greasy cheese stretching between bites, their giggles mingling with the sound of crickets. Evelyn leaned against the railing, exhaustion in her bones, but joy flooding her heart. For years she had carried shame, struggle, and doubt. Tonight, standing in the yard of a house she had bought with her own hands, watching her children laugh, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself in years. Aurora Analytics was still fragile in the grand scheme of business. There were competitors looming, investors watching closely, deadlines always pressing. But Evelyn Carter had come too far to turn back now. The Phoenix of Denver had risen, and she was only getting started. The invitation came in a crisp white envelope embossed with gold lettering. Evelyn Carter opened it at her desk late one Tuesday evening, her sons asleep upstairs, their laughter still lingering faintly in the walls of the new house. She read the words twice, then a third time. The International Tech Horizons Conference, Chicago, Illinois. She had been asked to deliver the keynote address. For a long moment, Evelyn just stared at the page. Her fingers trembled, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of what it meant. 5 years ago, she had left Chicago in humiliation, carrying nothing but a cardboard box and 3 unborn lives inside her. Now, she was being invited back, not as a discarded secretary, but as a CEO whose company was reshaping logistics. But then she saw the fine print at the bottom of the program. Among the featured speakers, Richard Hale, CEO of Hale Industries. Her chest tightened. The name alone stirred memories she had fought for years to bury. The glass office, the dismissive stare, the cold walk past her as security escorted her out. A younger Evelyn would have crumbled at the thought of facing him again. Now, she simply folded the invitation, set it neatly on her desk, and whispered to herself, "So be it." Still, that night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning. What if he mocks me again? What if he sees right through me? What if I'm not enough? She turned her head toward the hallway, where the faint sound of Mason's sleep whispers carried through the door. Downstairs, on the kitchen counter, a stack of investor reports reminded her of how far she had come. She pressed her palms together, steadying her breath. "No," she whispered into the darkness. "I am enough. More than enough." The decision came the next morning. If she was going back to Chicago, she wouldn't go alone. She would bring the very reason she had fought so hard. Her sons. At breakfast, she laid the invitation on the table between bowls of cereal. Matthew squinted at the gold lettering. "What's this?" "Mama?" "It's an invitation," she said softly. "They want me to speak at a big conference. In Chicago." Michael sat up straighter. "A conference like the ones you always have on Zoom. Bigger," Evelyn replied. "Much bigger. Leaders from all over the world will be there." Mason, chewing quietly, lifted his eyes. "That's where he lives." The table went silent. Evelyn's breath caught. Mason rarely spoke of his father, yet somehow he understood more than the others. She nodded. "Yes, that's where Richard Hale lives." Matthew tilted his head. "Will we see him?" Evelyn paused, weighing her words. "I don't know, but if we do, I'll be ready this time, and I want you 3 with me." The boys' faces lit up with excitement. To them, Chicago wasn't a place of old wounds. It was a city of skyscrapers, pizza, and adventure. "Do they have dinosaurs there?" Matthew asked eagerly. "And rules," Michael added. "Do they have rules for the conference?" Mason simply whispered. "I want to see the lake." Evelyn laughed, the tension easing from her shoulders. "Yes," she said. "Dinosaurs, rules, and the lake. We'll see them all." Over the following weeks, preparations consumed her. She worked with her team to refine the keynote address, every sentence honed to perfection. She arranged flights, security, and hotel accommodations. Late at night, she stood in her closet, debating what to wear, something powerful, but not harsh. Something that said, I belong here. Still, beneath her composure, nerves hummed like a live wire. One evening, after the boys were asleep, she stood in the backyard, gazing at the fading light. She thought of Chicago, the city where she had been broken, the city she had sworn never to see again. The very skyline had haunted her dreams. Now she was choosing to walk back into that lion's den. Her phone buzzed with a message from Thomas Reed. Proud of you, Evelyn. This is your moment. Don't look back. She typed back, I'm bringing the boys. A pause, then his reply, good. Let him see exactly what he threw away. Evelyn slipped the phone into her pocket, her resolve hardening. The day of departure arrived with a burst of dawn light. 3 small suitcases lined the hallway, each carefully packed Matthew's full of books and gadgets, Michael's perfectly folded clothes arranged by color, Mason's containing a sketchbook and a bundle of pencils. Evelyn fastened her own bag last, her crimson blazer neatly hung inside. At the airport, the boys buzzed with excitement. They pressed their faces to the glass, marveling at the airplanes taxiing down the runway. Evelyn held their passports in one hand, their small fingers clinging to the other. As they boarded, Matthew whispered, Mama, are you nervous? Evelyn knelt to meet his eyes. Yes, she admitted. But being brave doesn't mean you're not nervous. It means you go anyway. Michael nodded solemnly, as if memorizing the rule. Mason squeezed her hand, his blue eyes wide but steady. As the plane lifted off, Evelyn looked out the window. The ground fell away, the mountains of Colorado shrinking beneath the clouds. Ahead lay Chicago, the city of her downfall, and perhaps her greatest triumph. She closed her eyes and whispered a silent vow. This time, I walk in on my own terms. The hum of the engines was soft, almost soothing, as the sleek white jet cut through the sky. Evelyn Carter sat by the window, her crimson blazer folded neatly across her lap, while her 3 sons explored every inch of the private cabin Aurora Analytics had chartered. To the boys, it was an adventure. To Evelyn, it was a moment heavy with memory. Matthew pressed buttons on the reclining seat, delighting when it shifted from upright to nearly flat. Mama, it's like a robot chair, he exclaimed, his laughter echoing in the spacious cabin. Michael opened the leather-bound safety manual, reading it carefully as though he were preparing for an exam. It says here we have to keep our seatbelts on until the captain says otherwise. He informed his brothers with great seriousness. Mason, quiet as always, stood at the window, his small hand resting against the glass. His wide blue eyes reflected the endless clouds outside. It feels like we're flying into another world, he whispered. Evelyn smiled faintly, though her chest ached with the weight of his words. They were flying into another world, a world she had once left behind in shame. Her mind drifted back 5 years, to the last time she had traveled this route. That journey had been nothing like this. Then, she had boarded a crowded bus in the dead of night, the smell of diesel thick in the air. Her arms had ached from cradling 3 fragile infants against her chest, their tiny cries muffled by the hum of the engine. She remembered the sideways glances from other passengers, the pity in their eyes, the whispered assumptions about who she was and why she carried so much weight alone. She had stared out the window then, tears streaking silently down her cheeks, wondering if she would ever find a place where she and her sons belonged. Every mile away from Chicago felt like a burial of the life she had known, of the woman she had once been. And now, this. The boys sprawled across plush leather seats, negotiating over snacks with the flight attendant, their laughter filling a cabin worth more than her entire net worth back then. The Aurora logo gleamed on the jet's tail, a testament to how far she had come. Evelyn touched the window beside her, her reflection ghosted against the glass. 5 years, she murmured, too softly for anyone to hear. 5 years. And I'm not the same woman. The flight attendant appeared with a tray of sparkling water and small sandwiches. Ms. Carter, would you like anything else before we reach Chicago? Evelyn shook her head politely. Thank you. This is perfect. Matthew grabbed 2 sandwiches at once, while Michael carefully divided one into equal halves, insisting on fairness. Mason took only a sip of water before returning his gaze to the clouds. Evelyn's chest swelled with pride as she watched them. They had no memory of the night bus, no memory of her tears or the crushing silence of starting over. To them, life had always been about curiosity, fairness, and quiet wonder, and that was how she wanted it to be. Still, the contrast carved itself deep in her heart. She remembered the cracked vinyl bus seats, the rattling windows, the way her body had ached after hours of rocking 3 babies in her arms. She remembered fumbling through diaper changes in a station bathroom that smelled of bleach, whispering apologies to her sons as strangers stared. She remembered the crushing fear. What if I can't do this? What if I fail them? But those questions had been answered in the years since. She had not failed them. She had built a company from nothing, brick by brick. She had put food on the table, clothes on their backs, and now a home with a yard beneath their feet. And today, she was flying not to escape Chicago, but to confront it. Mama Matthew's voice broke through her thoughts. He climbed onto the seat beside her, crumbs dotting his chin. What are you thinking about? She brushed his hair back with a smile. I'm thinking about how far we've come. Michael leaned over the aisle, frowning slightly. Are you nervous about the conference? Evelyn considered the question, then answered honestly. Yes, but nervous doesn't mean I'm afraid. It just means I care. Mason slid into the seat across from her, his sketchbook in hand. He held up a drawing 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a bright sun. This is us, he said simply. Evelyn's throat tightened. She reached across the table, squeezing his small hand. That's perfect, sweetheart. The jet began its descent. Outside the window, the Chicago skyline emerged, glinting in the morning light. The Willis Tower rose proudly. The lake stretched like a sheet of glass, and Evelyn felt her pulse quicken. The city looked the same, but she wasn't. She sat taller, her sons chattering around her, the hum of the engines steady beneath her. 5 years ago, she had left Chicago with nothing but despair. Today, she returned with a company worth millions, 3 thriving sons, and a strength no dismissal could ever erase. As the jet touched down, Evelyn pressed her hand against the glass once more. Her reflection was clear this time, not blurred by tears. I'm ready, she whispered. The ballroom glittered with light, crystal chandeliers casting golden reflections across rows of champagne flutes and carefully placed hors d'oeuvres. The VIP reception at the International Tech Horizons Conference was designed to impress, and it did. Industry leaders mingled in tailored suits and designer gowns, their conversations a blur of mergers, valuations, and the next big thing. Evelyn Carter stood at the edge of the room, her posture graceful, her expression calm. She wore a tailored navy dress with clean lines strong but understated, enough to command attention without demanding it. In one hand, she held a glass of sparkling water. Her other hand rested lightly at her side, steady despite the storm of nerves that rippled beneath her composure. She had expected the moment all day, but when it finally arrived, it still felt like the air shifted. Richard Hale entered the room. For a split second, Evelyn saw the man she remembered: the expensive suit, the confident stride, the way others parted to make space for him. But then she noticed the subtle cracks. His smile was too tight, his movements a little too rehearsed, his eyes darting as if measuring who was watching. It had been 5 years, but she recognized the flicker of arrogance in his gaze. She also saw something new: fatigue. Richard scanned the room, his eyes passing over her once, twice, and then they stopped. Recognition dawned slowly, like a storm cloud spreading across his face. His jaw tightened, his glass wavered ever so slightly in his hand. Evelyn felt the weight of that stare, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she lifted her chin and gave him a polite nod, as though he were any other executive. It was Richard who broke first. He crossed the room quickly, his expression arranged into something neutral, though his eyes betrayed the jolt of panic he was trying to bury. "Evelyn Carter," he said at last, his voice low, careful. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Evelyn's smile was composed, her tone even. "Mr. Hale, it's been a long time." The nearby group of executives turned curiously, sensing history in the air. Richard forced a chuckle, as if to smooth the moment. "I've been following Aurora Analytics. Quite the rise you've made. From secretary to CEO. Remarkable." The word secretary lingered in the air like a barb. Evelyn caught the deliberate emphasis, the attempt to remind her of where she'd come from. But she only tilted her head slightly, her voice calm. "Yes, remarkable what can be accomplished when you're underestimated." A pause. The people around them shifted, intrigued. Richard's smile faltered for just a second, his eyes narrowing. "Well, I suppose everyone has their path." He lifted his glass. "You've certainly made something of yourself." Evelyn's gaze sharpened, though her smile never wavered. "I didn't make something of myself, Richard. I revealed what was already there." For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with the echo of old memories. Evelyn saw flashes in her mind, the cardboard box of her belongings, the icy dismissal in his eyes, the sting of betrayal. Her pulse quickened, but she stood firm. Richard shifted his weight, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Why are you here?" "Evelyn, to parade your success in front of me, to settle old scores." Evelyn leaned in slightly, her expression still serene. "I'm here because I was invited to give the keynote. The organizers seemed to think I had something valuable to say." Her words landed like a quiet strike. Richard blinked, momentarily thrown. He recovered quickly, adjusting his tie, forcing a laugh. "Well then, I'll look forward to hearing it. It's always good to see familiar faces." But his eyes betrayed him. Beneath the polished exterior, there was unease, even fear. Evelyn could see it clearly. Now the man who had once towered over her seemed smaller, diminished. She let the silence hang a beat too long, then offered a gracious smile. "Enjoy the evening, Mr. Hale." She turned away deliberately, engaging in conversation with a nearby CTO who had been watching with interest. She spoke with ease, her laughter soft, her presence magnetic, and though she didn't look back, she could feel Richard's gaze burning into her, unsettled, searching for ground he no longer owned. Evelyn Carter had walked into the lion's den, and she was no longer prey. The lights dimmed in the grand auditorium of the Chicago Technology Center. Nearly 2,000 people filled the seats, investors, engineers, journalists, students each waiting to hear the words of Evelyn Carter, the woman the press had begun calling the Phoenix of Denver. Backstage, Evelyn adjusted the microphone clipped to her collar. Her palms were cool, her heartbeat steady. She remembered the first time she'd spoken in front of a crowd, stumbling, nervous, unheard. Tonight, her words would carry weight. When the announcer's voice rang out, "Please welcome CEO of Aurora Analytics, Evelyn Carter." The applause surged like a wave. Evelyn stepped onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding her. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the packed hall. Rows upon rows of expectant faces stared back at her. For a heartbeat. She thought of that night bus out of Chicago, of 3 tiny infants in her arms, of the fear that had nearly broken her. She inhaled deeply and began. "Good morning," she said, her voice firm, clear. When people think about technology, they often think about numbers, about codes, about machines. But I want to start somewhere else with people. The audience leaned forward. "I stand before you as someone who knows what it means to be dismissed. I was told I didn't belong in boardrooms, that I wasn't fit to lead, that I would never be more than a name on the payroll. For a long time, I believed that. Until I realized our value is not defined by those who overlook us. Our value is defined by what we create, by how we choose to rise when we've been pushed down." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Evelyn let her words settle, then shifted seamlessly to the heart of her vision. At Aurora Analytics, we don't just write code, We build systems that restore wasted time, wasted energy, wasted lives. Our platform has already saved regional grocers millions of gallons of fuel and cut delivery times by 25%. But the numbers are only part of the story. The real story is a single mom who gets home earlier to read to her child. It's the small business that survives because costs drop just enough to keep the doors open. It's the cleaner air our children will breathe. A hush fell over the audience. Even the journalists lowered their pens, caught in the cadence of her voice. This is not just technology, Evelyn continued, her tone rising with conviction. This is humanity. This is the belief that every algorithm, every innovation must serve people first. Because without people, technology is nothing more than wires and code. Applause erupted, thunderous and sustained. Evelyn let it wash over her, then finished with quiet strength. 5 years ago, I left this city with nothing but 3 newborns and a determination to survive. Today, I return not as someone asking for a seat at the table, but as someone building a new table, one with room for all who have been overlooked, underestimated, or cast aside. That is the promise of Aurora Analytics. That is the future we are building together. When she stepped back from the podium, the ovation shook the hall. People rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some even wiping away tears. Evelyn bowed her head slightly in gratitude, her heart full. Backstage, as cameras flashed and conference organizers swarmed with congratulations. Evelyn's phone buzzed. She glanced down. A secure message from her legal counsel blinked on the screen. Acquisition complete. 52% ownership secured. Her breath caught. The words seemed to glow, almost unreal. Aurora Analytics had officially taken controlling interest in Hale Industries. Richard's empire, the company that had once cast her out like disposable paper, now belonged to her. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the phone. She closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. For years she had imagined this moment: revenge, justice, triumph. And now it was here. But it didn't feel like gloating. It felt like gravity, like a circle closing. She tucked the phone away, lifted her chin, and rejoined the crowd of admirers waiting to shake her hand. Somewhere in the audience, she knew Richard Hale had been listening, and somewhere deep inside, he had realized what the rest of the world now knew: Evelyn Carter was no longer the secretary he had dismissed. She was the woman who had risen from the ashes to claim not just her dignity, but his legacy. The Phoenix had arrived. The headquarters of Hale Industries towered over downtown Chicago, a monument of glass and steel. For Evelyn Carter, the sight of it through the tinted SUV window stirred a flood of memories, humiliation, tears, the heavy box of her belongings in her arms as she was escorted out. Now she returned not as the dismissed secretary, but as the majority owner. The SUV pulled to the curb. Evelyn smoothed the crimson blazer across her shoulders, then turned to her sons. They were dressed in matching navy suits and white shirts, their hair neatly combed, their eyes blue, unmistakable, shone with anticipation. She knelt, brushing a hand across Matthew's cheek. Remember what I told you. Be respectful, be brave, hold your heads high. You are Carters and Hales, Mason whispered, his gaze steady, quiet as always. Evelyn's chest tightened. She kissed his forehead and rose. Inside, marble floors gleamed, receptionists whispered, security guards stiffened. Everyone knew Evelyn Carter, now the Phoenix of Denver, keynote speaker, tech visionary. But no one was prepared for the sight of 3 identical boys trailing behind her. Heads turned, whispers followed. The elevator carried them to the 30th floor. Evelyn's heart pounded, not with fear, but with a deep, steady determination. This was the moment she had lived toward for 5 years. The boardroom doors opened. Inside, Richard Hale stood at the head of the long mahogany table, mid-sentence, gesturing toward charts showing falling profits. The board members sat in tense silence, their faces grim. When the door clicked open, all eyes turned, and then silence. Evelyn stepped into the room, heels clicking on the polished wood floor, her sons walking in perfect unison behind her. The resemblance to Richard was undeniable. The board members leaned forward, murmurs rippling. Richard froze. His polished confidence drained as his gaze fell on Evelyn. His voice faltered. "What is this?" Evelyn's smile was composed, her tone cool. "This, Mr. Hale, is a meeting." She gestured toward her legal team, who slid thick folders across the table. "And I thought it appropriate for my children to be present. After all, this concerns their future too." The board chair, an elderly man with sharp eyes, flipped open the folder. His face went pale. Inside were documents, birth certificates listing Richard Hale as father, DNA test results, and proof of Aurora Analytics' acquisition of 52% of Hale Industries shares. Before anyone could speak, Matthew tugged on Evelyn's sleeve, his voice bright with innocence. "Mama, is that him? The man in the picture on your desk?" The room froze. Richard's knuckles whitened around the back of his chair. Michael leaned forward, studying Richard with solemn eyes. "He looks just like us?" And then Mason, quiet Mason, asked the question that shattered the air. "Are you our father?" The words echoed through the boardroom like a gavel strike. Gasps erupted. One board member dropped his pen. Another pressed a hand to her chest. Richard's face drained of color, his lips parted, but no sound emerged. He staggered back a step, gripping the table for balance. Evelyn's expression didn't change. She sat calmly, folding her hands before her. "Children do have a way of asking the most direct questions," she said softly. "Perhaps you'd like to answer, Richard." Richard's eyes darted from the boys to the documents, then back again. His voice cracked. This is some kind of ploy, some trick. You can't." The board chair cut him off, his voice stern. "Mr. Hale, the resemblance is undeniable, and these documents, they are thorough. DNA results, notarized. There's no denying it." Murmurs swelled. Evelyn's attorney slid another folder across the table. Purchase agreements, transaction records. As of this morning, her lead counsel announced, Aurora Analytics has acquired controlling interest in Hale Industries. Ms. Carter now holds majority voting power. Richard sank into his chair, his composure crumbling. "No," he whispered. "This is impossible." Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes locking on his. "Impossible, Richard. 5 years ago, you told me I didn't belong in your world, that I was a problem to be erased with a check." And now she spread her hands to the documents, to the 3 boys staring at him with wide, questioning eyes. "Here we are." Matthew tugged on Michael's sleeve. "Why does he look so scared?" Michael shook his head. Maybe he broke a rule. Even in the heavy silence, a few board members smothered uneasy smiles. Mason's gaze stayed fixed on Richard. His small voice carried through the stillness. "I don't think he was ready to be a dad." Richard's face collapsed, pain flickering across his features. He looked smaller than Evelyn had ever seen him, no longer the untouchable CEO, but a man cornered by truth. The board chair cleared his throat. "Given this development, I suggest we recess to review the acquisition documents." Evelyn nodded graciously. "Take all the time you need. My children could use a short break." As she rose, the boys followed, their small shoes tapping against the floor. Richard's gaze clung to them, haunted, as if seeing not only what he had lost, but what could never be regained. For Evelyn, the moment was not revenge. It was revelation. She had come back to the place where she had been broken. And now, she left the boardroom not as the discarded secretary, but as the majority owner flanked by 3 living testaments to her resilience. The battle was over before it began. The boardroom emptied in a flurry of whispers and shuffling papers, leaving only Evelyn and Richard inside. The heavy oak doors closed behind the last director, muffling the voices in the hallway. Silence settled, thick and suffocating. Richard sat slumped in his chair, his tie loosened, his once perfect posture gone. Across from him, Evelyn stood tall, the picture of composure. The years had shifted their places. He looked worn, weary, diminished, while she radiated strength born of fire. At last, he spoke, his voice rough. "Why like this? Evelyn, why bring this circus into the boardroom? Why not come to me privately?" Evelyn's eyes narrowed. She stepped closer, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Privately, her tone cut like glass. "Do you remember the last time I came to you privately, when I told you I was pregnant? Terrified, looking for support. You called security. You wrote a check. You didn't even look at me as they escorted me out." Richard flinched, his gaze dropping to the table. It wasn't that simple. It was exactly that simple. She snapped. Her voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the sheer force of memory. "I sent you emails. Richard, dozens, begging you to acknowledge your sons. Do you know where I wrote them from? A hospital room, alone. 3 tiny babies in incubators, fighting for their lives, and me with no job, no money, no help, and you." Her voice broke, then hardened again. "You didn't answer once." Richard's hands clenched, white-knuckled. "I was under pressure, my family, the board. They were watching everything I did. A scandal would have destroyed my reputation. I was supposed to be the heir who never faltered, the man who carried the Hale legacy without flaw." Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "So you sacrificed us. You sacrificed them." Richard's breath hitched. I thought it was the only way. To protect the company. To protect everything I'd worked for." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Protect the company, Richard. You didn't just lose control of Hale Industries. You lost something far greater." He looked up, confusion flickering across his face. "You didn't lose just a company." "Richard," she said, her voice steady, every syllable deliberate, "you lost a family." The words hung in the air, heavier than any accusation she could have hurled. Richard swallowed hard, his face twisting. "I didn't know. I didn't know how to be a father. I wasn't ready. No one is ready," Evelyn replied softly, but firmly. "The difference is, I showed up. I stayed awake through nights when I thought I would collapse. I held them when they cried, when their fevers spiked, when doctors warned me they might not make it. I built a company with one hand while rocking a crib with the other. I was ready because I had no choice. You had every choice, and you chose yourself." Richard's eyes brimmed with something Evelyn had never seen in him before. Shame. He buried his face in his hands. "God. Evelyn. What have I done?" She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. This was the man who had once seemed untouchable, who had wielded power like a weapon. Now he looked small, hollowed out by regret. "You abandoned them," she said quietly. "And you abandoned me. You left us to drown. And the irony, Richard, is that it didn't save you. You lost the company anyway. You lost everything you thought you were protecting." He lifted his head, eyes red-rimmed. "Is it too late?" His voice cracked. "To know them? To try?" Evelyn inhaled deeply. For years she had imagined this moment him begging, her denying. But now that it was here, it felt different. Heavier. "That's not for me to answer," she said finally. "That's for them. But understand this if you want to be part of their lives. It won't be because you're Richard Hale, CEO. It will be because you're willing to be a father. And that requires more than money, more than a last-minute change of heart." Richard nodded slowly, tears slipping down his face. He looked broken, stripped of the armor he had once worn so easily. Evelyn turned toward the door, her voice firm. "Think about what you've lost, Richard. Not the buildings, not the stock price. Think about 3 boys with blue eyes who asked you one simple question today. Are you our father? You couldn't answer. One day, you'll have to." She opened the door, her figure framed by the light from the hallway. Without another glance back, she walked out, her heels clicking like punctuation marks against the marble floor. Richard remained behind, alone in the cavernous boardroom. For the first time in his life, surrounded by power and wealth, he realized just how empty his world had become. The story spread like wildfire. By the next morning, headlines blazed across every major outlet. Fired secretary now owns former boss's empire. The Phoenix of Denver takes flight in Chicago. Evelyn Carter ousts Richard Hale from his own legacy. Journalists clamored for interviews. Television anchors debated her rise as if it were a modern fable. Was she a ruthless opportunist or a symbol of resilience for Evelyn? The noise hardly mattered. What mattered was the truth: she had built something no one could ever take from her. Within days, her face appeared on the covers of Forbes and Time. One headline read, "The woman who rewrote the rules of power." Another, "From secretary to CEO, Evelyn Carter and the future of tech." The photographs were stark and powerful. Evelyn seated in her office, her sons beside her, their identical blue eyes staring into the camera. The image told its own story, not just of success, but of survival, of a family unbroken by betrayal. Meanwhile, Richard Hale's world collapsed. The once confident heir of Hale Industries was stripped of his CEO title, demoted to a single non-executive seat on the board. The press devoured his downfall, dissecting every misstep, every missed opportunity. His name, once synonymous with strength, became shorthand for arrogance and short-sightedness. Evelyn, however, did not gloat. She had no need. His downfall was his own doing. Her focus turned inward, to the empire she now commanded. Aurora Analytics and Hale Industries were merged under a new name, Aurora Hale Group. It symbolized rebirth and continuity. The rising flame built atop old ashes. Evelyn made it clear that employees would not suffer the way she had. Maternity leave was extended. On-site childcare was established. Flexible work hours were normalized. The first floor of the Denver headquarters was transformed into a family center, filled with toys, books, and caregivers. If I could build $1 billion company while rocking a crib with one hand, Evelyn told the press, then no parent should ever have to choose between their children and their career. In her new office overlooking the city skyline, Evelyn hung a single frame on the wall behind her desk. Inside, it was the check Richard had once given her, $75,000 signed in cold ink, his attempt to erase her and the children before they were even born. Beneath it, a small brass plaque read, "The price he thought we were worth." Visitors often paused at the frame, their brows furrowing as they pieced together the story. Evelyn never explained further. She didn't need to. The check spoke louder than any speech. One evening, after a long day of interviews and board meetings, Evelyn stood alone in her office, the city lights glittering outside. She turned toward the framed check, her reflection ghosted across the glass. She remembered the moment he handed it to her, his eyes cold, his voice detached. She remembered clutching it in disbelief, humiliation and rage colliding in her chest. And she remembered shoving it into a drawer, vowing never to forget. Now it hung in her office not as a wound, but as a monument, a reminder of how far she and her sons had come. The boys, of course, were less impressed. "Mama," Matthew asked one evening when she brought them to visit, "why do you keep that old piece of paper on the wall? It's not even colorful." Michael peered at it with narrowed eyes. "It looks like a bad grade." Mason, thoughtful as always, stood in silence for a moment before speaking. "It's a story," he said softly, "like a picture book. It tells where we started." Evelyn smiled, her throat tight with emotion. "Exactly," she whispered, brushing Mason's hair back. "It tells where we started, and how we'll never go back." The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Reporters followed her every move. Investors flocked to her company, eager to align themselves with a woman whose resilience had become legend. Employees once fearful of Hale's wrath now spoke of Evelyn with admiration, even gratitude. Yet, amid the whirlwind, Evelyn remained grounded. Each morning, she still made breakfast for her sons, still listened patiently to Matthew's endless questions, still admired Michael's meticulous order, still cherished Mason's quiet sketches. The world saw the Phoenix of Denver, but her children saw only Mama. Late one night, as she prepared notes for another press interview. Evelyn glanced once more at the framed check. The brass plaque glinted in the lamplight. Her lips curved into a faint smile. Richard Hale had tried to put a price on them, but no number could measure the worth of survival, of love, of a future reclaimed. For Evelyn Carter, the check was no longer a scar. It was her crown. The headquarters of the newly christened Aurora Hale Group gleamed brighter than it ever had under Richard's reign. The glass facade reflected the morning sun, and for the first time in years, employees entered the building not with dread, but with energy, with hope. Inside, on the floor directly beneath the executive offices, a new space had opened, something Richard Hale would never have imagined, let alone approved: the Aurora Family Center, brightly painted walls, shelves stacked with books and puzzles, quiet corners for naps, and a sprawling garden terrace filled with flowers, grass, and playground equipment. Evelyn had insisted on every detail. She remembered too vividly the isolation of those first years, rocking 3 fragile infants alone at night, praying she wouldn't collapse before morning. She vowed no parent working for her would ever face that kind of loneliness. This company was built on resilience, she told the design team months earlier. But resilience doesn't mean doing it all alone. It means knowing you're supported. Every parent here will know their children are not a burden. They are part of our future. The day the family center opened, employees wept. Mothers who had hidden their pregnancies for fear of being sidelined now carried their babies proudly through the halls. Fathers who once worked late into the night without seeing their children now spent lunch breaks pushing swings in the garden. The atmosphere of the company shifted, quietly but profoundly, and no one embodied that transformation more than Evelyn's own boys. Matthew, Michael, and Mason were the first to race through the new garden, their laughter echoing between the glass walls. Matthew darted from flower bed to flower bed, peppering the staff with questions. Why are the petals different colors? How tall will that tree grow? Can we make a telescope to see the birds? Michael stood at the sandbox, carefully dividing it into neat sections with toy construction cones. We'll need rules, he declared. This part for castles, this part for tunnels. No mixing. The other children obeyed without question, amused by his seriousness. Mason sat cross-legged beneath a maple tree, sketchbook in hand. He drew the scene with slow, deliberate strokes, children running, sunlight spilling across the grass. His brother's faces lit with joy. Occasionally, he looked up at the headquarters looming above them and then back at the page, as if capturing not just the image, but the meaning of it all. Evelyn watched from the terrace, her heart swelling. She had stood in this building 5 years earlier, broken and discarded. Now she stood as its leader, its reclaimer, its reimaginator, and below, her children played freely in a space she had carved out for them, and for every child who might come after. An older employee, a woman named Janet who had worked reception under Richard, approached Evelyn with tears in her eyes. "I never thought I'd live to see this," she whispered. "He used to say kids had no place in a serious company. That family was a distraction." Evelyn smiled gently. "That's because he saw only profit margins. I see people, and people are more than their job titles. They're mothers, fathers, daughters, sons. The future belongs to children, Janet, not to CEOs who rule by fear." Janet nodded, her voice trembling. "It feels like healing." Evelyn's gaze drifted back to her sons. Matthew was now teaching another child how to balance on the seesaw. Michael was meticulously organizing the toy bins. And Mason had finished his drawing and was showing it shyly to a younger girl, who clapped her hands in delight. For Evelyn, it was more than a scene of play. It was a vision of tomorrow. She thought of the late nights coding with a baby balanced on her lap, of the endless bills, of the rejections and dismissals. All those battles had not just built a company, they had built a sanctuary. At lunch, she gathered her boys under the shade of the maple tree. They ate sandwiches while the hum of city life carried faintly from the streets below. "Mama," Matthew asked between bites, "will every company have a garden like this someday?" "I hope so," Evelyn said. Because every child deserves a place to laugh and grow. Michael frowned thoughtfully. But some companies don't make good rules. What if they don't listen? Evelyn brushed his hair back, smiling softly. Then we lead by example. We show them it can be done. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change the world. Mason, quiet until now, set his sketchbook in her lap. On the page was a drawing of the garden, filled with children, the headquarters in the background, but above it, he had drawn something else, a rising sun, golden and radiant, casting light across the scene. Evelyn's throat tightened. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. It's the future," Mason murmured. She hugged him close, the weight of his words sinking deep. Yes, the future was not in boardrooms ruled by men like Richard Hale. It was here, in gardens where children played, in offices where parents didn't have to choose between their work and their families. For Evelyn Carter, the greatest victory was not the acquisition, not the headlines, not even the billions in valuation. It was a world where her children and every child would grow up knowing they mattered. The Phoenix of Denver had not risen to burn. She had risen to build. And in the laughter of children echoing through the halls of Aurora Hale Group, the promise of that future had already begun. The supervised visitation was held on a quiet Saturday afternoon in one of the conference rooms at the Aurora Family Center. The room was arranged to feel less formal, soft chairs instead of a long table, a box of toys in the corner, coloring books stacked neatly on a shelf. Yet the tension in the air was unmistakable. Evelyn stood near the glass wall, arms folded, her expression unreadable. She wasn't there to intervene, only to observe. A court-appointed social worker sat unobtrusively in the corner, clipboard in hand. Richard Hale entered slowly, almost cautiously. Gone was the commanding stride of a CEO who once owned every room. He looked smaller, thinner, his suit slightly loose, his expression nervous. His eyes flickered first to Evelyn, then to the three boys seated on the carpet, building a tower of wooden blocks. They looked up in unison, their identical blue eyes locking onto him. The air seemed still. "Hi," Richard said, his voice uncertain. "I'm Richard." Matthew tilted his head. "That's not what Mama calls you." Michael frowned. "You're late. We were supposed to start at 1 o'clock. Mason said nothing. He simply watched, quiet as ever, his expression unreadable. Richard's throat tightened. He crouched down awkwardly, his expensive trousers creasing. "You're right. I'm late. I'm sorry. May I sit with you?" The boys exchanged glances. Finally, Matthew shrugged. "Okay. But don't knock the tower over." Richard lowered himself carefully, his movements stiff. For a few moments, silence reigned except for the clatter of blocks. Richard picked up a red one, held it out. "Where should this go?" Michael snatched it from his hand. "Here. The base has to be balanced, or it'll fall. That's the rule." Richard nodded, chastened. "Got it. Balance first." Evelyn watched from the wall, her chest tight. She had imagined this moment for years, him trying. Awkward and uncertain. She felt a storm of conflicting emotions, anger for the years he'd lost, pity for his fumbling attempts, and something harder to name, hope. Maybe, though she didn't trust it. After a while, Matthew lost interest in the tower and began peppering Richard with questions. "Do you like airplanes? Have you ever been to space? Can you run faster than Mama?" Richard laughed softly, the sound rusty, as if unused. "No, I've never been to space, and I doubt I can run faster than your mother." Evelyn's lips curved faintly, though she quickly masked it. It was Mason who shifted the atmosphere. He had been sitting apart, doodling quietly in his sketchbook. Now he tore out a page and walked over, holding it up to Richard. It was a math problem, carefully written in a child's handwriting. 37 plus 46. "Can you help me?" Mason asked, his voice calm but searching. Richard blinked, startled. He looked down at the paper, then back at the boy's solemn eyes. Slowly, he nodded. "Of course." He picked up a pencil. "Well, first we add 7 and 6. That makes 13. So we write down 3, carry the 1. Mason leaned in, following closely, his small brow furrowed. When Richard finished, Mason whispered, 83. That's right, Richard said softly. You're good at this. His throat tightened. Really good. For a moment. Father and son, though, strangers shared something genuine. Evelyn's hand tightened on her arm. The sight pierced her, stirring feelings she had locked away for years. She saw Richard's eyes glisten, his composure slipping as Mason leaned against his arm, comfortable for the first time. The social worker jotted notes quietly. When the session ended, the boys gathered their drawings in blocks. Matthew and Michael bounded toward the door, eager for snacks. Mason lingered, slipping the solve math page into his pocket before following his brothers. Richard stood, his voice low, unsteady. Thank you for letting me see them. Evelyn met his gaze, her own steady, though inside she churned. This isn't about me letting you, she said quietly. It's about whether you can prove to them you're worthy of the title they asked you today. Father. He swallowed hard, nodding. I want to try. She studied him for a long moment, torn between disbelief and the faintest flicker of trust. Part of her wanted to slam the door, to remind him of every unanswered email. Every night she sat alone in a hospital, praying her sons would live. But another part, softer. Quieter, wondered if the boys deserved at least the chance to know him. When Richard left, Evelyn remained by the glass wall, staring out at the city. Her reflection looked back at her, strong, unyielding, but tired. She whispered to herself, do I protect them by keeping him out, or by letting him in? The question lingered, heavy and unresolved. 6 months passed, and the name Aurora Hale Group was now etched across headlines around the world. What had begun as Evelyn Carter's small startup had transformed into a global powerhouse. The company's valuation had doubled, crossing milestones that once seemed unthinkable. From London to Tokyo, from Sao Paulo to Johannesburg, Aurora Hale became synonymous with innovation, integrity, and resilience. And at the center of it all stood Evelyn. She had graced the cover of Fortune as America's most influential CEO. The New York Times ran a Sunday feature calling her The Quiet Revolution, How Evelyn Carter Reshaped Corporate America. Universities invited her to speak not only about logistics algorithms, but about leadership, motherhood, and what it meant to rise when the world tried to silence you. She had become more than a business leader. She had become a symbol. But for Evelyn, symbolism was never the point. Every headline, every accolade, every award was secondary to the life she had built for her sons. In her Chicago office, the framed $75,000 check still hung on the wall, but no longer as a wound. It was a reminder, a quiet testament to the distance she had traveled. Near it sat Mason's sketches, Matthew's notebooks of questions, Michael's carefully labeled toy bins from the family center. These, not the balance sheets, were the true markers of her success. On a crisp autumn evening, Evelyn stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the Aurora Hale headquarters. The city sprawled before her, alive with glittering lights, a constellation of ambition and dreams. In the distance, the Hale logo still crowned one of the towers, but now it stood beneath the rising flame of Aurora. The two names together told a story: destruction, rebirth, transformation. Behind her, in the adjoining lounge, her 3 sons slept soundly after a day of exploring the children's center downstairs. Matthew clutched a book about space. Michael had lined his toy cars in precise formation, even in sleep. And Mason's sketchbook lay open on the armrest, half-finished drawing of a phoenix rising above skyscrapers. Evelyn watched them for a moment, her heart tightening with love. Then she turned back to the city. Her thoughts came unbidden, quiet but steady. This was never about revenge. The words formed in her chest like a vow. Revenge burns out quickly. But legacy that endures. This was about creating a world where my sons will never be treated as disposable, where women will never again be told they are less, where families are not liabilities, but strengths, where no one is silenced by the arrogance of power. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, no longer the frightened young woman escorted out of Hale Industries with a cardboard box, but a leader forged in fire, a mother whose scars had become her armor, a builder of futures. She thought of Richard. Their interactions over the past months had remained tentative, supervised. He was no longer the untouchable CEO, but a man learning, fumbling, facing the wreckage of his own choices. Whether he could change was yet to be seen. But Evelyn had made peace with one truth: his redemption was not her responsibility. Her responsibility was here, in the sleeping forms of her sons, in the thousands of employees who now thrived under her leadership, in the generations of women who would hear her story and know that they, too, were worth more than the world allowed them to believe. The city pulsed outside, vibrant and restless. Evelyn lifted her chin, her voice a whisper meant only for herself, but also, somehow, for everyone who had ever been told they were less. This isn't about me. This isn't about revenge. It's about justice, about dignity, about leaving behind a world where no one will ever again be discarded as I once was. She placed her hand gently on the glass, as though touching the horizon itself. And that, she said softly, will be my legacy. The clock struck midnight. The Phoenix of Denver stood tall, framed by the glow of a city that had once tried to bury her. And in that moment, Evelyn Carter knew that her fire would burn far beyond her lifetime, lighting the path for every soul still fighting to rise. Evelyn's story is not just about business or betrayal. It is about dignity, resilience, and the choices that shape our lives. Too often, society tells us our worth is defined by others, by a job title, by wealth, by whether someone chooses to see us. But Evelyn reminds us that true value is never handed to us. It is claimed through perseverance, integrity, and love. She could have been broken by rejection. She could have let bitterness consume her. Instead, she built a future not just for herself, but for her children, proving that legacy is not measured in profits, but in the lives we touch and the values we leave behind. And perhaps the deepest lesson is, this revenge may feel satisfying in the moment, but it is empty. What endures is justice, compassion, and the courage to create something better than what hurt us. Evelyn rose not to destroy, but to build, and in doing so, she created a world where her sons would never be seen as disposable. For each of us, the challenge is the same: to rise from our own ashes and leave behind a legacy of light, not bitterness. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today and walking through Evelyn's powerful journey. If her story touched your heart, please don't keep it to yourself. Share it with a friend who might need the encouragement. And if you'd like to hear more inspiring stories like this, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss the next chapter. Your support means the world. It helps us keep telling stories that remind us all of the strength, dignity, and resilience we carry within.